Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Today we have another live episode. This is really kind of a live collaboration because today we have a very special guest, friend of the show, and we're a friend of his show, Sina Rahmani from The East is a Podcast. I want to say quickly too, like if people don't, we have their Patreon in the link. Make sure you do that, but also they have a YouTube channel and there's some great videos over there too. And so I just put that in the chat and I hope folks will, subscribe to that as well as ours. Of course, like the video, share it, tell your friends. And, today, basically, we wanted to have a conversation to talk a little bit about the axis of resistance, but do it partly through a little bit of the story of Qasem Soleimani, who, of course, the U.S. assassinated back in 2020. And obviously, talk a little bit about Iran and the relationship that Iran has to the various forces within the axis, and how we should think about that beyond the sort of ridiculous framing that we get from Western media of everybody being evil Iranian-backed terrorists. And obviously that's not it's much more interesting and complicated than that. And so anyway, I'm excited to bring Sina Rahmani to the stage to talk with us all today. Sina, welcome to the show.
Hello. It's good to see you, man. I have to say, your video, you're now the streaming king. I remember we have this is inside baseball, but I remember messaging you and be like, bro, man, you gotta do this pivot to video business. Like, pivot to video happened in 2015, and we're sitting here podcasting away. Like, what are we doing? And I have yet to take my own advice, but you certainly have done amazing video work. So congratulations and thank you. I'm happy to be on. It's fun to be on. It's been too long, and this is the second iteration of this conversation in a way, because we did this in January, what, 2020, which is like
Yep.
roughly 1800 years ago, um, which is like
Yeah,
crazy,
I went
crazy,
back and
crazy.
re-listened to part of that, and I was like,
Yeah,
"Oh, man," like,
yeah,
it feels like I'm listening to myself from, like, another lifetime. I mean,
yeah,
it's just like I'm a political baby, I feel like, in that conversation,
yeah,
but that's just the way that things develop, and actually, I mean, there's definitely elements of that conversation that I think, are relevant, and we'll kind of go into
yeah.
deeper here, but it was also interesting too because I realized how much, like, I mean, in some ways, we both were, like, afraid that we were on the brink of, like, global war at that time,
Right.
and now, you kind of see a lot of the dynamics that we sort of talked about in that episode, um, where, and still we'll try not to be too, overly, I don't know, what it to make predictions, right, about what's gonna happen because we don't know, but, anyway, yes, and then shout out folks have, yeah, the Tanky group therapy, I think a lot of folks have been enjoying these, which, also are on sometimes they're on Justin Podor's,
Yeah.
video
we
channel, right,
co-publish we co-publish them. And he
Yeah,
puts them on his YouTube channel, and I put them on as audio too. This is great. It was a joke at the beginning, the name, because that's been kind of like my term for group podcasting. That it's like political podcasting, because it's a kind of group therapy, because like we live in
it
this like
is.
insane political climate where like, and especially for like people like us in this weird sort of like, I guess, like tankosphere that I call it. We have so few kind of media allies. The metaphor I used recently, metaphor, it's a fancy word for reference to a Simpsons episode, was like Homer at the lesbian bar. And I think it comes to me a lot, that image of him just like sitting there and it's like, wait a minute. And like you just think that like how alone you are in the world, at least in some places in like the media world. Because yeah,
Right.
like talking about these things is like no go for people. To like talk about Qasem Soleimani, for instance, like
Yeah.
people lose their minds. You can't even post his picture on Instagram. They will take it down. Like his face haunts like the Western normie sphere, which is hilarious
I,
to me. It's
yeah,
it's
I had
it's
somebody just yesterday tell me, I was saying something and I was saying, like, I didn't wanna take a side in something, and he's like, "Well, by having a conversation about Qasem Soleimani, you're having
yeah,
a side."
exactly. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know? Um,
It's a dirty
well,
topic. It's a dirty topic, and unless you're some like frothing at the mouth Iranian comprador like dissident, that's the only place for Iranians. And like a lot of the even the so-called like left podcast sphere, it's just like riddled with a ton of and like and I try not to be like a chest thumping nationalist on this stuff. Like fuck, I don't even live in Iran. Like I've never lived. I lived there when I was a baby. Like what is that? What right do I have to even like have opinions? I mean, yeah, my family lives there. Like I have family there and stuff, and like yeah, I like follow it and everything. But it might as well be like an object of like the news for me, like the way that it is for most people here who are listening to this even. Like yeah, okay, I have these connections, but still like it's so like I always think that like given the rank opportunism, the like insane amount of astroturfing when it comes to Iran stuff, just like the deranged loons also who run about. I mean, half of them are like open disgusting Zionists, and they're like having to show how Zionist they are during this, which is hilarious to me because Zionists like make their allies kiss the ring in public. Um, like not even thinking about like, well, they're gonna lose some credibility, but that's the whole point. Like Zionists want you to like show that you like lick their boots. But yeah, like so I'm on here with the hope to sort of inject a little bit of critical perspective. I'm not an Iran expert by any stretch. I don't. I also don't really believe in like the necessity of having expertise to like have these conversations because that's also just like a trick of academia to kind of stand on that. Like, and I have, and in the meantime, since our episode, there have been some interesting things that have happened in terms of the sort of legacy, the battle over the legacy of Qasem Soleimani and his name, his kind of, and what his life came to represent and how to interpret it. And it's interesting. We can go into them individually, but yeah. So thank you. That's
yeah,
that's kind of like my intro spiel. Um,
right on. Yeah, and I think, yeah, I mean, I look forward to talking about it. And as far as the discussion of sort of experts, I mean, Sina, I just would say, like, you interview more brilliant people in the region that we're discussing than anyone else. And so, if anyone has a right to say something about it, I think it's you, even if it's just by what you probably have learned through the work of doing your
yeah,
podcast beyond, like, so
yeah.
yeah, I mean,
No, I've been very lucky to have. That's true. I'm very proud of my show. It's a very good show. Sometimes I talk too much. I just have so much to say. I feel like, oh God, get this thing out of me. But yeah, like I've been lucky to have a lot of cool people come on the show. I've also been lucky to like produce content for other shows. And yeah, like my life has changed a lot since we like my work, I mean, podcasting work has changed a lot since we had our meeting. Obviously, so is yours. The show has grown by a lot, by the way. So yeah, like it's interesting to come back and kind of revisit this stuff.
yeah. Yeah, and then we also did that conversation right after Al-Aqsa flood with, Francis
Oh
too, so, like,
yeah, that's true.
that
That
feels
did
like a long
huge
time ago, but
numbers.
that's much more recent. It did,
Yeah.
it was actually our biggest episode last year. Um,
Damn.
but, so, yeah, so let's get into it. So let's talk about Qasem Soleimani. The US assassinated him back in January of 2020. And at the time, like, I think a lot of people were like, "Oh, this is a big deal." We had our episode with you a little bit about it to understand a little bit about why this was a big deal. But I think it's interesting because, like, obviously, isn't a very important figure to the development of what is called the axis of resistance. And now we see, perhaps more than in prior conflicts, I would say definitely more, um, that force and what, those actually that set of different forces and how when they're kind of coordinating together, um, they can certainly not directly, like, it's still very asymmetrical. I'm not trying to suggest that they, have the military power of the United States or even Israel, but they punch significantly above their weight class, and I mean, even one of the things you said in that conversation was war is cheap now, and you can see how, with things like drones, with rockets, and so on, and with obviously, like, in Hamas's case with the tunnel infrastructure and so on, um, that we're seeing more and more of what these forces are able to do, and then obviously Ansarallah, in Yemen and attacking the ships, and so anyway, I just wanted to bring you on to kind of talk about Soleimani in relation to the axis of resistance, kind of how this, as you try to understand it, the axis developed over a kind of what period, and some of the major conflicts that it emerged and developed through from your point of view.
Yeah, so I guess the outset is to understand that like the trick of sort of talking about this is that there's this sort of biographical life of Qasem Soleimani. Um, he's born in Kerman, relative like to like a poor family. He sort of goes to work early. He has this almost Dickensian story where his dad owed money, and he had to go work for his family, and he had to sort of be the main one of the main breadwinners. But I'm gonna skip. I'm not gonna sort of focus a lot on the biographical details because I'm struggling. I'm struggling myself, and this is something that I've thought about a lot. Is that like how do you like when we talk about these like sort of historical kind of arcs, right? And his is interesting because he lives at this really like critical historical time, right? Like he dies in what is his 60s, I think he was like early 60s. He's born in the 60s, I think. I should have looked this up, but essentially, like he's a teenager. He's very young when the Iranian Revolution happens, and that Iranian Revolution, this was a landmark moment in the Palestine struggle. I'm gonna go so far as to say that because it introduced a new factor that couldn't simply be bought out. I mean, think of what 1979 was. 1979 is Camp David, right? 1979 is when Egypt says like no more. Okay, we're not going to be the main backer of the Palestinian resistance. Or is it 1978? It might be 1778 actually, but it's around that
Just
time. Camp
Yeah,
David. Yeah,
just quickly, so Soleimani was born in 57, so he would have been
57.
like
Okay, yeah. So
very
he's just
like
yeah, he's almost
22,
my mom's age. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he but and think about that. That means he's 20, 57, 20. He's 23 when he's 22 when the revolution happens, right? When the Iranian Revolution happens. And so think about that time. Think about what he witnessed in his life prior to that. Think about like the deprivation of Iranian living, especially in places like Kerman, which doesn't have much going on economically. So to think about that in the context of like this wider upheaval, I mean, we cheapen the phrase revolution a lot, partly because neoliberalism does that. Like everything's like, oh, revolution in makeup, or revolution in popcorn, like like we use it a lot, but like this, like the Iranian Revolution was like truly one of the rare, like great, like capital G, capital R revolutions of the 20th century, like hands down. Like, our Eurocentric mind, when we think of revolutions, we think of Delacroix and the painting and the French Revolution and storming the whatever, the palace, the whatever, like, and that shit, like beheading and stuff. But like that's just our Eurocentric brains. But like this happened in our lifetime, right? Like there's a famous newspaper issue of a newspaper of an Iranian newspaper that says like the Shah left, the Shah is gone. Like this is not something that occurs just like this is a rare thing. And in fact, like part of the imperialist toolbook is manufacturing fake revolutions and using those to achieve to achieve some kind of political fuckery. And we're gonna get to that when we get to the 2010s. But essentially, I would say that the story of Qasem Soleimani is the story of a kind of the boomer generation of my mother's generation, my parents really, and how like there are the revolution really upends everything they knew. And so to like give you like a scale of things, like my mom told me this story about they had like in her family they had like a, you know, I mean, I'm embarrassed to say this, but they had kind of like a houseboy, like a helper who would kind of help my mom's family. And she told me this story about they were doing something one day, and he said to someone else, they were in public somewhere, and he said, "Oh, the Shah is here." Like the Shah came through, and somebody slapped him or punched him in the mouth, like some cop or something. And he's like, "How dare you say his name?" Okay, like that's the level of terror that like Iranians lived under. And to think of like the undoing of that, and like pretty goddamn quickly too. I mean, yeah, there were a lot of the trail of the revolution is pretty long, sure. Like, but like it's a lot of things rapidly happen to like, and it really lives up to like the Lenin quote, right? Of like sometimes if what is it, weeks and months, with like the weeks and months quote. Sometimes
there
it
are
feels like nothing happens in months, or whatever, weeks go by and it feels like months, something like that. It's the famous Lenin quote.
there are yeah, there are
Weeks
weeks when
where
nothing happens,
nothing
and
happens.
weeks when I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
weeks
there's
when decades happen, something like
there
that.
are decades when nothing
When nothing
happens, and weeks when
happens, that's
decades
what it is.
happens. Yeah,
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 something
yeah,
like that.
yeah.
So and so partly recognizing this and thinking about what that must have done to that generation of Iranians. And yeah, for a lot of them it traumatized the fuck out of them. Right? Like they just like a lot of them left before, left during, or left in the aftermath. Like my family's part of that. And like, you know, it was partly has to do with the war that was the Iranians call it the imposed war, right? The so-called Iran-Iraq war. That's it. Thank you. There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. So thank you, Ricky. So part of this story is like part of the story of Qasem Soleimani is the kind of is the sort of multiple is the multiple outshoots of history that happens to like that generation of Iranian boomers, right? Like that generation specifically. Now, in the midst of all this, partly what happens in the aftermath of the revolution is the formation is like like the Iranian military is in shambles. You know, because a lot of it was like this kind of patronage around the Shah, like the upper echelons, right? And so like, and that, I mean, this is common after a revolution, right? Because the army was like a huge support base, like was needed to be a part of an integral part of the state, and it is an integral part of the state. So reorganizing it is no small feat, and part of the sort of, let's say, statecraft of the Islamic Republic of like those early days of Khomeini and the sort of people around him was to create on the one hand a kind of popular, what's like what could be only called like a popular militia. Those are like the what's called the Basij, and that's like a kind of popular militia that's like at the very local level, like, you know, like some in Iranians in diaspora, and maybe some in Iran too, I imagine, will say like, oh, they're like a, you know, a hated bunch, but like this is like a key sort of sector of the sort of Iranian state, and partly it's something that you see in response to the sort of periodic moments of like street uprisings. You know, like this happens, and this is part of the game. And like Iran is no different than a lot of other states. They have like degrees of statecraft, of like police, right? Like, which is like a violent apparatus to like respond to any threats to that. And part of, and like, and I could, and I like to think of like the force, the IRGC, the Islamic Republican Guard Corps, this Guardian Corps, this was Sepah Bastaran. This is like, this was the kind of ideological wing of the Iranian military that was created, that was controlled directly by Khomeini, and the sort of directly around people, is that there wasn't a separation between them. And this is where Qasem Soleimani enters his military career, right? Him and a generation of other men join the IRGC, and that's where they make their name. And the IRGC plays an important role in the response to the Iraqi invasion, the invasion of Saddam, which was supported by all of the various Arab factions, right? Like Arab League, another Arab League. The only one who was critical of it was Syria, right? Like under Hafiz al-Assad, right? The PLO was pro-Saddam in those days, okay? You have to remember that. So
Hmm.
the arrival of the Islamic Republic and the instantiation of this new, like relatively frightening, and like, yeah, I've heard stories of those days. It was frightening. Like, I don't want to like be here and like just sort of like sugarcoat this stuff. I've heard these anecdotes, but like but part of the overall scheme of like what I'm hoping to sort of represent here is that like the Islamic Republic has had these like um 45 years of history, partly because its legitimacy as a state has been upheld, right? Has been upheld. It's
Hmm.
proven that it could withhold, that it could withstand, not like multiple wars. It could withstand, like economic wars in the form of sanctions. It could withstand all kinds of deep state fuckery, of like divisions within the ruling class, like all the contradictions that any state has to like stand up to. Iran has sort of, the Islamic Republic has done that and more. Now, in the midst of all this, there are guys like Qasem Soleimani who make their name, or make their names, or make, let's say, like their bona fides, their military bona fides, in the so-called imposed war, right? And Qasem Soleimani is one of them. There's this, actually, I saw this archival footage of him. He was like in his 20s, and he was training soldiers to go and fight on the fronts, right? Like this was a brutal war. I mean, Iran, like there are different figures. But typically it's sort of said like 500,000 is thrown around, and like billions and billions and dollars and hundreds of billions of dollars in damage, like infrastructure. And also remember that like the support that Saddam got, like the sort of regional support that Saddam got, was complemented by foreign support from Europeans, Americans, right? Like American intelligence. So like what we have to understand is like the Ukraine-Russia war right now is a kind of, I don't want to say mirror image because that's like irresponsible, but it is a kind of, I would say, a reiteration of like a strategy that imperialists have, which is like one way we'll do, like one way that we'll approach our enemies is to bog them down in regional conflicts, so they
Yeah.
can't use their resources to build up their military or whatever, or statecraft or infrastructure, right, to like strengthen themselves, but they have to use it on these costly wars. And so like I've said this from the beginning, that the Ukraine stuff has the Ukraine using Ukraine as a proxy, which is what it is, to stoke tensions and to like and eventually like break out in this war. Like this is not all that, this is like a typical strategy for imperialists, right? Like if they could do it, if they could wage a war on China in the same way, they would. And like they tried, the best they could do was a lot of the assets in like 2010s, right? Like that's really the best they could have done. Early 2010s, right, where you had the East Turkestan Islamic whatever, like and like partly the response to that, the Chinese response to that, which was very carceral. Like that's partly of like what we hear now is like the so-called Uyghur genocide, right? And like these are kind of moves that imperialists make against each other, that, or not against each other, but against other their enemy states, in the hopes of bogging them down, or the hopes of making it sort of like the degree of difficulty of survival that much harder. So Qasem Soleimani and his generation of dudes from the IRGC, but in general the Iranian military, these guys were forged in this war, right? And like it created them. Now, this is something to think about. Like this is an ironic. Go ahead.
One interesting thing that I read today too, I was reading some of Saad's work, and she also noted that like Hezbollah's origins
Yeah,
actually in
I was
part
just gonna get
develop
to
out of
that.
that war as
Yeah.
well. Yeah, I sorry, I don't mean
Yeah.
to
No,
preempt you,
no, it's true. No,
but
this
is
is
it?
this is this is what this is the thing, is that like you have to, like it's almost like this strange kind of like Hegelian kind of movement of history, because from the 1979 revolution you can draw a line to partly the panic of the imperialists in invading Lebanon, right? The invasion of Lebanon is partly a panicked response to like the fear of what could be, like what they saw, and they correctly saw it. They did see like what was coming down the pipeline of like a strengthened, emboldened Iran, who is now the de facto state sponsor of the resistance. Now, remember, in 1979, the Palestinian resistance have lost their main backer, Egypt. Syria's a mess, right? They still have Syria, which is like a big backer, sure, and it still is to this day. It's partly why it's subject to so much intense destruction, right? And so like partly what happens is that Iran, a much bigger country than Syria and a much wealthier country than Syria, um, that doesn't have the backing of the USSR, by the way, right? Because that's another thing that the USSR also helped Iraq in the war. And so like here's this third actor, here's this actor who shows up, which has its own motivations in terms of that are ideological, right? Like the Iranian, the force that Qasem Soleimani came to be the leader of, the Quds force. I said this in our first episode. This is like they named it the Quds force because Iranian foreign policy has like a goal. It has like a telos, and that's like Jerusalem, right? Al Quds, right? And so like the liberation of Palestine is the goal, you could say, of Iranian foreign policy. Like that's just like straight up. That's the goal of it. It doesn't, how it achieves that is, that's a big question. But like that's partly why they named it that. And so, in some ways, to think about Iran now as a factor in the struggle over Palestine, like it's like, oh, Iran has entered the chat. Like this was not something they were expecting, right? Like this was not like Carter himself was, at Christmas 1978 or like New Year's 1978, he made this famous speech. Oh, Iran is an island of stability, right? In this turbulent something, right? And so like they had no clue what was coming. So things look really bad, and especially given that they were able to take Egypt away out of the factor, and on top of that, they're destroying Lebanon. Right, like Lebanon is undergoing this civil war, which is being aided by all the same actors, by the way, who are boosting Iraq, right? Like in their invasion of Iran. Like this is a turbulent time in the region, right? Like I mean, now unfortunately that turbulence has continued, but partly the response. And so in the midst of all that, in 1982, a little war criminal who talks like a penguin named Ariel Sharon, who's still alive, who's a vegetable today. I'm pretty sure he's still alive. He hasn't kicked the bucket. He's a vegetable somewhere. I would have remembered if he died. But this guy in their hubris decides to invade South Lebanon and begin to achieve the dream of controlling Lebanon south of the Litani River, right? Like this is the goal. And they occupy Lebanon for what would become 18 years, okay? Like just think about that today. Think about where we are now, where you have 100,000 Zionist settlers in the north of occupied Palestine having fled to the south of the country. Think about that. Now think about the reversal, the like ironic reversal of history that would have, this is like having, like Marx would be laughing at all of this if he could witness this, that like this reversal of fortune, of let's say historical flows of people, right? From Lebanese who are usually being chased out of southern Lebanese, right? Who are usually being chased out of their homes. Now it's the opposite, right? And partly how we get here is the part of the story of how we get to this point are guys like Qasem Soleimani and the IRGC and the connections that they make. And yeah, like there are religious bonds that Iranians don't share, say, with most of the Palestinian factions, all of the Palestinian factions, right? Because these are like in Lebanon, these are 12er Shias, right? This is like one of the main branches of Shiism. And so like Lebanon is part of this like older cultural fabric, right? Especially South Lebanon. So like there's a natural inclination towards a kind of solidarity between, but I don't want to push too hard on that because it's bigger than just simply sectarian connection. I think here is that like the story here is that one of imperial hubris. I kind of kick around two different theses, and I haven't gotten an answer. And if your chat has an answer, I'd be happy to take that into. But like on the one, did they invade knowing that they would have this potent enemy that named Hezbollah, the party of God, and they kind of announced themselves in this letter, and they were a kind of popular movement. Like this was populism. Like they believe in like even though they don't name it as socialism per se, and they're not communists, that like partly the story of Hezbollah is about like is partly has to do with a kind of almost Latin American style populism, like militia populism, right? Where you have a kind of peasant class who are armed and are trained to resist a far more modern and advanced army, right? Like this is and in guerrilla warfare, right? And like this is what happens over the course of the 18 years of occupation. So like to go back to like the thing is that I wonder, is it the case that they knew what was coming and they said, well, we're going to slow them down by being there, that they can't grow as a power. And so we're not going to let them just simply exist. And so we're going to occupy them. We're going to bug them. We're going to torture them. We're going to set up prisons. We're going to find a proxy force, a comprador force who will do our dirty work. We're going to keep the development low. We're going to periodically destroy any advancement. We're going to terrorize farmers, kill shepherds, right? That like just to remind them of who we are. Like, did they do this knowing that they were slowing down the creation of this force, or did they do this not thinking that and they helped accelerate it, right? Like which one is it? I don't know. I don't know which one to believe. I guess it depends on which model of history like you ascribe to. And so like for me that's the kind of question. Like was it something that they did trying to slow it down, or was it like trying to slow it down something that was going to happen anyways, or did doing what they did result in accelerating the creation of this force? Now part of the answer to that question lies in 2006, which is a kind of accelerated, which is partly a response to the sort of humiliation that they suffered from leaving Lebanon in 2000. But partly it's also like you can connect the way that I connected Iran, like the so-called imposed war, to Ukraine. I think you can connect Al-Aqsa flood to the 2006 Lebanon war, because the 2006 Lebanon war is the same, and the same structure is that you had this kind of operation. Now, mind you, Al-Aqsa flood was a much larger operation than what 2006 was. 2006 was 4 guys, right? Like 4 guys, 2 army, like it was like 4 dudes they took. One of them, I think a couple of them died. The exact number, I mean, it's a handful of guys. And they use that as an excuse to wage this war, right? In much the same way that Al-Aqsa flood is the excuse for the Zionists to do genocide. They want to destroy Gaza, right? And this is actually a bigger and somewhat darker question that I have sometimes, where I'm like, obviously the point is to destroy Gaza. Like they don't care about the captives. They obviously don't care. This is not
Right.
like as if they give a shit. Like, come on. Like the point is to brutalize and torture and set them back. You set back their development, you set them back, you force them to spend time building apartments and building water lines and building electricity poles, right? Like, and then you also choke them, by the way, with this like violent blockade. So that's obviously the goal here in all of this. And so like having achieved that, they're going to move on and move backwards. And even though it looks like a victory, like this is something that we can debate. And a lot of like pro-resistance people would like I imagine would be annoyed by this argument, because it's essentially saying that the Zionists are kind of holding the cards in what's happening. And I'm not sure on this answer of mine, but either way, 2006, the story of 2006, it's this 33-day war. And it features a lot of what we're seeing now, like massive destruction. Like they leveled South Beirut. I mean, South Beirut is where Hezbollah has its administrative and kind of media foothold. I walked around South Beirut in the early 2000s, before the 2006 war. I was in Beirut in it was 2004, which is crazy to think now. I would go, it was funny, in the area of Hezbollah, I remember pulling up, I was staying in a refugee camp, Palestinian refugee camp, Burja Barajni. And I remember pulling up, and then I was like, yo, that's Khomeini. Like, there's a big picture of Khomeini. And for a second, I'm like, am I in Iran? Like, did I accidentally go to Iran? Like, but it turns out it was just because it's a Shia area of town. So, of course, there's going to be pictures of people like Khomeini, right? And so like part of the story of understanding this struggle is that like understanding these, I think these complicated sort of like, and also like mind boggling, because there's just so many wars, right? Like the Gaza wars are hard to count at this point, because there's 2008, 2013, 2018, 2021, like I think I missed one, 2004, I want to say. Like I probably missed one there, but like part of the story here is that Zionists do these military operations. They used to call it mowing the lawn, right? This was part of their official military doctrine. I think we mentioned this in our episode with Francis, is that like they would call these the wars between wars. Is that you, and this was a Ben Gurion thing. This was like something that goes back to Ben Gurion, is that you wage these wars, you find excuses to wage massive wars, so you set their development back so that when big confrontations happen, then they don't have the firepower, that they can't do the damage they once did. Right. And it also is like good for your own military machine. I mean, Israel is one big military industrial complex. Right. And that's partly why like Hamas, like Qasem, and the other Palestinian resistance factions from Gaza have managed to hurt the Zionist machine so much, because it is this kind of sensitive economy that requires this intensive capital base, technology, all kinds of all kinds of tech requirements. Like this is not some simple economic structure, right? This is not people feeding themselves. This is like a massive like Western country in the midst of a very different, much less developed region, right? Economically, technologically, whatever, right? And so like to maintain that, they need ports, they need constant shipping, right? And guess what happens? Like Ansarallah says, sorry, you're not gonna have a shipping industry anymore. So all of this is to say that like Qasem Soleimani plays a role, and guys like him play a role in creating these multiple nodes of resistance, right? That our stupid media here call proxies. But the thing is, proxies is what we have. That's what our imperialist powers have, right? Like the FSA is a proxy, the Free Syrian Army is a proxy of the Gulf countries, Turkey and the West, right? These are their main backers, and they do the dirty work. And in fact, most of their soldiers are not Syrian. They are in fact foreigners, right? Like Chechens, Uyghurs. There's a whole Uyghur village in Syria right now, in Idlib, right? And so like partly the story here is dueling Islamisms, is what I like to try to call it. Is that on the one hand you have this kind of like radical sort of Sunni, and it's not just like Sunni Shia here, because it's bigger than that, because some Hamas is Sunni. Now, in the midst of all this, it's complicated because in Syria, Hamas, the political side of Hamas takes the side against al-Assad and the Syrian government. And like there's this insane story. I mean, this will tell you the story of like what Syria was. And Qasem Soleimani's, like biggest, probably like the most important sort of a historical role probably is there. And also in the battle in Iraq against ISIS, is that there's a scene from Syria where you had, it was Hamas dudes using tunnel digging machinery in Syria to build tunnels for fighters who are fighting against the government. And Iranian guys who had trained them on those machines show up, and like Syrian guys also show up and find them, and they like see them. Like this is an actual story from Syria. And so like part of understanding the sort of the line from the Islamic Revolution in 1979 to the invasion of Lebanon in 1982 to the where else in the midst of all this? I guess, in the midst of all this, you also have to say the decline of the Soviet Union and the fall of a kind of Arab bloc in the early 90s. And then through the 2006 and then the 2010s and the Arab Spring and the Dirty Wars, right? And you have to also include Yemen in all of this. Like this is an arc of extreme destruction and violence. Like our region has seen incredibly like horrific violence for decades and decades. And it's like it's hard to fathom in all this. And like a lot of stuff you see on Qasem Soleimani, like it's one or two ways. One, it's like the normie, like Al Jazeera. Like if you search on YouTube, it's all Qasem Soleimani's assassination, Qasem Soleimani's assassination. Like it's all like media gloating, right? And like this is part of like the war over his legacy that I brought out at the beginning. Or it's on the flip side, it's usually Shia people from different places like Pakistan, like Yemen, whatever, Lebanon, people being like, oh, this is the legacy of Shahid Qasem Soleimani, right? Or Iranians, right? And so like in the midst of all this, since his death, there has been this kind of battle over his legacy, to the point where they got the most weasel of monkey weasels. His name is Arash Azizi, This guy could not write his way out of a paper bag if he was forced to. And this guy gets a book contract to write what is an extremely shitty book, which is basically a crappy Wikipedia. Like, don't even read it, don't even look at it. Like, but unfortunately, because of the nature of our like Zionist and like imperialist media apparatus, it's like one of the first things you get. And like this guy like ripped like this guy was a mediocre grad student when he wrote it, and he got a book contract. I mean, sure, it was like a shitty press. It's a shitty press now based in the UK. So it's whatever. But like, oh, by the way, this guy's also coming out with a book on women, life, freedom. The thing that happened 10 minutes ago, this guy has a book coming out already. Okay. So if like partly the story here of understanding like anything to do with Iran, especially a guy like Qasem Soleimani, is that you have a ton of grifters who are just like feasting upon this shit, who just like who jump on this stuff, and they ensure that what you see is like imperialist fucking flip-flop. And partly the story of his assassination was to kind of be a spoil sport of all of this, is that like it had become apparent that the strategies that the imperialists employed to destabilize Syria and destabilize Iraq, like, let's get this out of the way. ISIS was an American creation. ISIS was an American creation. Say it now with me, everyone. ISIS was an American creation. When you want to talk about ISIS, talk about its funding and its training and this sort of, and the pipeline through Turkey, which is an American ally, right? And then you talk about the funding and support through the Gulf countries, which are American proxies. And then you also have direct assistance from the American troops occupying Syria, occupying Iraq, right? Like partly what he was carrying with him the night that he was assassinated, according to Iranian sources, is like proof that the US flies ISIS dudes all around, right? And like, you know, here's this funny story about ISIS. They're the SDF commander, the Syrian Democratic Forces, right? Which is like the rebranded Kurdish faction. I think it's like the PKK's military, but like rebranded, because the PKK is labeled as is designated a terrorist organization in European countries, so they couldn't call it that. So an American general comes up with the name the SDF. Okay, that's first of all, which is funny. Second of all, guess who? It's riddled with former ISIS guys, right? Like there are major guys in it who are ISIS guys, right? And so like I did an episode with Christopher Halali. He fought with the SDF. He's a Kurdish Iranian. He fought with the SDF, and he told these stories about how they would find ISIS guys and then they would get driven off in motorcycles, never to be seen again. Right? Like, I wonder where they would go. I wonder the fact, you think it's an accident that like Abu Baghdadi, like Baghdadi, he just ended up in a military prison in Iraq that's like held by the Americans? You think they didn't use that as a cauldron to like find the most loony, psychotic, like freaks and cook them up into this thing called ISIS? And you think it's an accident that ISIS shows up the year after America leaves? The year after America, it just shows up, this massive force with tanks, which is able to occupy 1/3 of Iraq. I mean, that is like, to think about this, and like, and so part of the role that Qasem Soleimani plays, not just in Syria in defeating ISIS, but in Iraq, right? So think about it. This guy fights against Saddam and the Iraqi military, which was patronized by the planet, right? Like patronized by all the major powers, including the USSR, including the West, including the Gulf, all patronized by all of them. He fights, they successfully withstand that. Part of the reason why Iranians lost that war, came to a stalemate, is because they started using chemical weapons supplied to them by Germany, right? Like this is part of that story, and that's one of the reasons why, like, because part of the strategy, and people can argue about this, was that the Iranians at that time said, like, this Saddam guy will do this again. He'll just bide his time, do it again. So we're not gonna take some sort of like fake peace offering from him. We're not gonna like let him get off the hook. And so like they continue this war after this so-called peace offering, and like after like year 2 or something. And so like part of this, at least the belief there, was this guy will do this again. This guy is an ally of the West. He's supported by the West. He was put in power by the West. Like he was like a CIA goon, subcontractor goon. Like, what do you think he's going to change? So what? He throws some scuds at Israel, like in the 90s, and like pays for some Palestinian martyrs. Like part of the question here is that, like, in the sort of evaluation of the life of Qasem Soleimani, is the strange and sort of like the vicissitudes of foreign policy of the Islamic Republic, and how it flexes its regional power, and it is the regional power, right? It's one of the largest countries, if not the largest. It has a massive population. It also inherited a very modern military from the Shah, right? Military that was paid for like in Iranian oil, like at huge prices. So like they still fly Tomcats, like F-14s, right? These incredibly old planes. Now they're getting upgraded through Russia, and that's part of the story here too, is how Russia plays in all of this. And Qasem Soleimani, for instance, a part of the story, part of his story, one of his many sort of like accomplishments in his CV or whatever, like the kind of whatever you want to say, is that he convinces Vladimir Putin after like many rounds to say like, okay, we're going to enter into Syria, right? Because he basically went to him as part of the stories that he went to him and visited him. And it was multiple rounds of this, but after one of them is that it was summer of 2015 when like the FSA and ISIS is at the gates of Damascus. Like they're about to fall. Iranian IRGC, Hezbollah had done what they could. They had already been there for years. They couldn't fight the tide. They couldn't wage a war against like multiple different factions, and didn't have an air force, right? I mean, they had the Iranian Air Force, but the Iranian Air Force is nothing compared to what they had, compared to the anti-aircraft weaponry that the Syrian rebels had, the so-called Syrian rebels. And so to get back into like the actual Qasem Soleimani part of this, is that this guy's life overlapped with this era of incredible historic violence and change, but most of which failed to achieve the goals of the people who initiated it, right? Like most of like it failed. They failed multiple times in Gaza. They failed multiple times, and because the goal is to break the resistance, right? And they've never been able to do so. They failed in Lebanon. They failed in Syria. And so like the story here of this guy is really told in the survival of these resistance groups. And so like part of what I try to like get across to them is that like the Iranian support for these resistance groups in terms of material support is not that much. I've heard varying figures. The figure from the US State Department, now mind you, this is the US State Department. This is 100 million. 100 million US dollars. I've also heard 25 million. Okay? So it's somewhere between those two, you can be sure. This is peanuts compared to the
Yeah, it's not that
multiple
much money either way.
billions.
Yeah.
Think about what they get for that money. Think about what happens with that money, right? And like this is like a remarkable story of like, yeah, like I said earlier, like war being cheap, but also resistance to imperialism is not something you do for money. You do it for survival. Whereas imperialists like wage war partly to back their own economies, right? Like America needs to sacrifice Ukraine so it can shake down its European vassals for state funds to send to American military contractors. And like it's like a mafia, right? So like there's no Iranian, like the Iranian military like machine is not that big, and besides what they make they can't bring to Palestinians in great numbers. Like there are sort of examples of weapons being shipped, and yeah, like they get them some, but ultimately that one of the accomplishments of the IRGC in all of this has been it's the teach a man to fish sort of paradigm, right? Is that like
Right.
you don't make them dependent on arms deliveries, you don't make them dependent on a military apparatus like Egypt, right? Like that because of its political leaders decides, okay, we're gonna pull the plug, right? Because the military doesn't control the state controls the military. Now Egypt's a different example because the military is the state, but that military is aligned with the Camp David Accords, and it values them and it requires them to enrich their elite and their ruling class. And so Egypt is out of all of this, right? And Egypt is actually an important sort of like ruling faction of the Zionists, is a sort of ruling comprador faction of the Zionists, torture Palestinians because they control those axes. I mean, yeah, like it's iffy. Sometimes you wonder about like the role that these tunnels played, right, and all this, because there's a ton of tunnels that go between both sides of Rafah, right? And you wonder about that, and that's partly the goal of the Zionists. That's one of the things that they've tried in all of this, is to control, I think, like it's so-called the Philadelphia axis, which is like right at the border. They essentially want to make sure that no tunnels thing, and which Egypt won't allow in all of this. But like what we're seeing now well, I guess the sort of global thesis I would have, if I'm going to get to one, is that what we're seeing now is the unfolding or the kind of blossoming of a strategy that really began in 1979, which is to consolidate all of the sort of anti imperialist forces in the region under a main backer, but that backer is not going to insist on any kind of ideological or religious purity or even philosophical or political purity, right? Like one of the hallmarks of the Islamic Republic's support of the Palestinian factions is that like we don't care who you are. We'll give you, if you want backing, we'll back you. Like PIJ, which is the force that is ostensibly allied with Iran, that's like openly allied with Iran, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. That's just one of them. It's one of the smaller ones. Compared to Qassam, they're not as big, right? Qassam is Hamas. Qassam is the military wing of Hamas, which is connected to, which has this kind of influence over which connection, political connection to the Brotherhood, which of course took an antagonistic role in the Syria mess, right? And so like it didn't punish the military wing of Hamas to say that, oh, since you guys participated in Syria, we're not going to support you anymore, right? Like the Palestinian liberation struggle is separate from the regional sort of quandaries, let's say, that blew up in Syria. I mean, not separate from, because Palestinians are involved in this too. Like there are Palestinians in Egypt, Palestinians in Syria. Like Syria was also like a huge supporter of Palestinian resistance. Like Syrian weapons help Palestinian resistance for a long time. I think the cornet, comes from Syria. I think the famous cornet, which was debuted in the 2006 war. So overall, I would say is that like the lesson to be taken away, and just don't listen to the normies on this because they're hysterical. Half of them are Zionists anyways. And that like they talk about Iran-backed, but it's not like the backing of the Islamic Republic is not a determinant, is not the determinant that you think it is because of where we live. Like we think that, oh, when you're backed by the West, and it's correct to think this, you're a proxy of the West, because that's what the West is. The West is this imperialist force that enacts its foreign policy through proxies. Iran is an ally to the Palestinian resistance, to Ansarallah in Yemen, which we haven't even gotten to, because that's another faction in all of this. And so, like, there are videos of Qasem Soleimani in Gaza, right? Like, this guy gets to Gaza, right? Like, going through tunnels and stuff coming through. There's videos of him in occupied Aleppo, right? Like, he was a mover and a shaker. There's videos of him in the deserts of, like, just, like, pointing at towns, but partly this was by design. Like, partly what they found in this guy, the Islamic Republic, was found, and the resistance in general found in this guy was a kind of very charismatic figure, right, who inspired a lot of the soldiers. Like you watch these videos with him, this guy was genuinely inspiring to those guys who were fighting, right? Like, I mean, I said this in our episode, I remember saying this in our episode, but like the Syria war was like the Spanish Civil War for the region. Like Syria, like was the Republican sort of like face, like keeping the Republic alive and like successfully is a kind of equivalent of all of this. And so the role of the Islamic Republic in that resistance, and Hezbollah too, right? Because is something that you have to consider in this guy's legacy and in the so-called axis of resistance, which actually is a phrase coined by Hassan Nasrallah in a speech, where he kind of divvies up the various forces of who are fighting in Syria. He says, there's the takfiri, there's the sort of sectarian, there's the sectarian sort of like Islamist or whatever, not Islamist, that's because they're all Islamists. There's the sort of like the takfiri axis, there's the Brotherhood axis, and then there's the axis of resistance, right? And this constitutes Hezbollah, this constitutes the Syrian government, this constitutes the IRGC, and the IRGC, was there, and he was there, and at the same time is when also ISIS is sent to Iraq by their American backers and wreaks havoc on this country that is left with nothing. I mean, it had been hollowed out by American occupation. Their oil wealth is being controlled in a bank in New York City, right? Like they're like, I think there's like this story of like is it Barzani, is like desperate. He's like, we have ISIS guys on our borders. This Iraqi government refuses to help me. The Americans that we've been dealing with refuse to send any help. And he calls Qasem Soleimani. They get guys there and helicopters there the next day, right? And so like this is like a, was it the Barzanis? Yeah, that was the Barzanis. This is like a clip. And so like this is something that I think in the grand, like you have to really study these conflicts to get a sense, but this guy is in all of them. Right? He's there in all of these places, and it makes sense because like these are our neighbors. Like this is Iran's neighbors. Like Syria, Iraq, like this is like the region. So if like you're gonna naturally have allies, and those allies are gonna reach out to you in these times of need, and how you answer them is a reflection of your foreign policy. Like you think Egypt sent like support to the Syrians? Like I mean, Egypt was under the control of Morsi and the Brotherhood, and in fact, that's one of the things, interestingly, that caused the military to intervene, the Egyptian military to intervene and basically press Control Z on the Egyptian Revolution and the Arab Spring, is that they were like, sorry, buddy, you're getting a little too sectarian. We're not going to support the dirty war on Syria. We're going to stay neutral, which is more or less what they did. And because like the guy, like Morsi was openly talking about like being anti-government, being anti-Assad and stuff, and so like that's part of what brought him down. Partly. There's a lot of other factors, but like these are all like dynamic, interactive, like crises that that are very, very bloody, that like extend over the course of years, and we haven't even gotten to Yemen. So that's the
Yeah.
kind of global overview. That went on way too long. I'm sorry.
No, that's all good. I mean, I think, Syria in particular is one of those, very thorny subjects with folks. And even like talking to a lot of Palestinians recently, they're like, it split us. I mean, like,
Yeah,
my father was this way, we felt this way, and especially in the early days, because the way it started out was not necessarily something that you'd automatically think like, oh, this is, you know, an imperialist proxy or whatever. But
yeah,
then once the US and the UAE and everybody else start to get involved, as one person said, that I won't name them because I don't know if they'd want me talking about this in this, but they said Assad's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch.
yeah, yeah. I know that quote.
You know,
Yeah, yeah.
and
No, and
and
that was the design. The design was to exploit the one of the main contradictions of the resistance axis, right? Like of the let's say the anti-Zionist movement in the region, was that you have this really hard problem of like, yeah, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a very serious force, partly because of the Qataris, but partly because of history, and it has a very deep and bitter relationship to the Assad family in particular, but also the Syrian state, because they got wrecked. I mean, that's the only way you can say it. They got wrecked in the 70s and the 80s, right? Like they got wrecked. Like that's it. Like and that's partly is that like they went to war with the Syrian state and the Syrian state beat them. And like you can talk about the evils of the Syrian state, but like these are antagonists. These are antagonists, and one was the victor and one was the loser, or the vanquished, or whatever. And the vanquished were able to sort of take refuge outside of Syria. A lot of the people who survived left the country. I mean, I know Syrian Americans who left in that time, and it's not, these are not neutral things. There is opposition to these governments. To say that there isn't opposition, you're deluding yourself. Now, what is the character and nature and scale of that opposition? Yeah, that's the question, right? And so in Syria is where all the contradictions come together, right? And they clash. And then you add to that $2 trillion of external support. That's with a T, $2 trillion. So $2,000 billion went into this people's revolution. Okay, that's what they call it, the people's revolution. $2 trillion. Imagine what we could do in the US with $2 trillion of state support, and not just like of like state backing of multiple states, right? Like the CIA spent $1 billion a month in Syria. It raised 2 proxy armies. 2. Okay, not just 1, 2, right? It occupies 1/3 of the country, right? It destroyed the 3rd largest city, Raqqa. Like destroyed it with the Air Force. Could you imagine having those kind of allies backing you, right, in a struggle against the American regime.
But
Like,
yeah, I hear you, but I think also like this is a fundamental problem also with the way that the United States wages wars at this point too. Like you cannot just like I mean, the idea that you can just bomb people like, like I don't know. I mean, the whole air power thing, like you're seeing it with Palestine as well, in Gaza. I
yeah,
mean, it's like it's ruthless and it's devastating.
yeah,
But it even goes against their own doctrines of like counterinsurgency and so on. And I mean, Syria is complicated because obviously the forces that we're talking about in terms of Hezbollah, in terms of Qasem Soleimani, they fought a counterinsurgency war in
yep,
this case.
yep,
And so it's like it's inverted, right? And
yeah.
like,
It goes
like
against our
yeah,
natural inclinations to like resist and to like think of insurgent forces as the good guys, right? And for some people here, and they'll yell at you, they'll yell at me for you for posting this. They could yell at me now. If they're listening to this, they probably aren't. But like for a ton of people, I don't know how many, but like a ton of loud people, let's put it that way. Like they are the good guys. These like psychotic, like right wing Islamist actors, people who are like Al Qaeda, right? That's Al Qaeda is FSA, FSA, Free Syrian Army is Al Qaeda. Al Nusra, like this is Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda is an ally of the U.S. empire. Okay, so either it's one of two things: they switch sides, or they were always on the side of the U.S. and they were like a convenient target to sort of just use as this kind of like enemy to wage what is now in retrospect a regional genocidal war that spans from Afghanistan to Yemen, from Pakistan to, I mean, I don't want to say, well, yeah, okay, let's just include Pakistan, fine. But like, this is a massive regional war that they called the War on Terror, but really, this was a massive, massive, really the last ditch efforts of the U.S. empire to make a kind of lasting victory, right? Because it hadn't had a W in a long time, guys. Like the U.S. empire had not, they lost in Vietnam. Now, mind you, and I say this a lot, is that losing in Vietnam it means killing upwards of 5 million people possibly, but also like making a lot of money for your military industrial project and sacrificing 60,000 Americans, as if they give a shit about dead Americans, about traumatized family, about PTSD, like war veterans or whatever, as if they give a shit. So like losing for the American empire is not really losing, I always like to think, but like ultimately losing in the sense of not achieving their goals. And their goals, right? Like unlike Iranian goals, which are stated, the goals of the US are, global domination, right? Regional domination, controlling this energy rich region completely, because it has a lot of it under its thumb, but not its entirety. And so like that's why the petrodollar exists, and that's where the US flexes its power. And the petrodollar is interactive with the military machine that the U.S. is based upon, right? Like, and also Israel too, right? Like Israel is a military industrial complex that masquerades as a country, right? That like has this like religious psychotic like popular base, right? But mostly it's this tech economy that's like feeds a military machine, right? Like filled with conscripts, by the way. They can't even get like a volunteer army up and going. They have to have it conscripted. So like in all of this is to say like Qasem Soleimani runs headforth, and Islamic Republic, they run headforth into like the machine of the US empire. And wherever they confronted, either directly or indirectly, like I would say that the Islamic Republic, I think it's fair to say this, that they overall are victorious, because the U.S. does not get its way in Yemen, right? 2015. One of the reasons why they started the war against Ansarallah in 2015 is also one of the reasons why they started the war against Iran in 1980, was to punish Yemenis for daring to be independent and daring to achieve sovereignty, right? And for daring to sort of take up a position against empire. Right, like that's just straight up it. And so they said that, okay, so they got their Saudi and UAE proxies together, and they got their band together, and they said we'll be done in a week. And in two and we all know how that ended, right? Like that did not achieve what they wanted to. And part of the story there is Iranian know-how and Iranian support to a point, right? Because if Iran was more involved in the Yemen war, you'd know about it. Like it would have
Yeah.
been different. Like I think people overplay the role that Iran played in in Yemen. I think that there was some support. So, for instance, in the hit on Abqaiq, the Aramco hit in the fall of 2019, I think personally there was Iranian involvement of that. The degree of involvement, I don't know. Like I don't know, because Iranian military technology also is plays a role in all this, because in this time frame the cheapening of military warfare occurs, right? From 2000, let's say, to 2001, which is when the US invades Afghanistan. They bring billions and billions of dollars of their expensive hardware and they just fly it around like this psychotic rich kid who takes all his toys to school and to his friend's house and just leaves them around. So what happens? They lose a couple of Reaper drones, not Reaper drones. It was the I want to say MQ-9. I think that is the Reaper drone. I can't remember actually. They lose a couple of their big drones, right? More than a couple, but like either Iraqi resistance brings them down, or they wander into Iran accidentally, or whatever, or like they get brought down. And part of what happens when you wage a war is that you lose your hardware. Guess who wins? Guess who picks it up? Your enemies pick up that hardware, right? And then they study that hardware and they learn from it and they learn how to build their own. And so, like in some ways, you can say that Iran's UAV military power is thanks to the U.S. empire, right? Like
Yeah.
is the seed of it is given to it by the U.S. empire. This is like a strange historical irony of the Iraq War. And another one is that dislodging Saddam. And again, this is totally Orientalist. I can't believe I'm going to do this. People, you should tar and feather me, but I'm going to do it. But this releases this genie in a bottle of 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 pro-Iranian support among Iraqis. There is a good contingent of Iraqi, largely but not entirely Shia, who back Iran ideologically, who support Iran. Not entirely, right? Like there are a lot of anti-Iran actors in Iraq, but there's a lot of pro-Iran actors too. And so partly I've been focusing a lot on Syria so far, but partly what happens in the 2010s in Iraq with the establishment of ISIS, with the ISIS, the sheer insanity of ISIS, right? Like we're talking about like massacres in like the hundreds, right? Like the Camp Spiker massacre. Like they would just take Shia guys, murder them on the streets, like film it. Like this is a terror army that was supported and like backed by state actors, right? Like this was an actual terror army, a terrorist army with tanks and artillery, right? Like this was not some ragtag group of dudes with Kalashnikovs. This was a serious force. You only get that with state support. You only get that with state support. And so part of what Qasem Soleimani's legacy in Iraq is the Hashd al-Sha'bi. Now, the Hashd al-Sha'bi, the PMU, Popular Military, right? Like this is a mostly Shia, but not entirely, group of like militias that were called together, and they were initially formed after a call through. It was Sistani, Ayatollah Sistani. And Ayatollah Sistani is like the kind of spiritual leader of the Iraqi Shia. He has an interesting relationship with Iran. I mean, he's a follower of Khamenei, right? That sort of like liturgical or sort of, well, not liturgical is not the word, but like that kind of like, the religious sort of institutions, yeah, like definitely they are not hostile to Iran by any stretch. But politically, I would say that Sistani, he's an interesting political actor. He doesn't. I mean, it's complicated. We have to get I want to get an Iraqi actually on my show soon to sort of work our way through Sistani's legacy, because he's an interesting character in all of this. But what Sistani does is that he basically does this popular call. He says, Iraqis, we need your help. Our country is on the verge of being taken over by actual barbarians, like head choppy, baby raping, like barbarians, like who are burning down our villages and murdering our children. So like we need this popular force. And guess who arms them? Iran. Iran provides the material and the logistical support for this backing. And there's not just, and it's not just it's the PMU, but also there are also Afghan factions, right? Like that's, I think that's called the I want to say the Liwa Fatimayun. That's the Afghan factions that like basically it's like anyone like this. This was the sort of Spanish Civil War analogy that I made earlier. Is that like there was a popular call where people from around the region came to Iraq, to Syria at different times, mind you, and they established themselves. They established themselves as this kind of defense force. Now, you want to take up issues with the PMU? Go ahead. Like, go ahead. Sure. Like, you want to cite human rights violations? Like, we can totally talk about that. But I would say overall, the choice, like, if you look at the Iraqi state now versus when 1/3 of it was occupied by this little group called ISIS, right? Like this psychotic, like just like mind melting evil, right? Like who, by the way, have never attacked Israel. They did once and then they apologized. Just so happens to be the case, right? That like, you think who also provide an excuse for the American military to occupy Syria, to occupy Iraq, right? Like they just so happen to provide that excuse, right? So like to think about those things, like if you're going to choose between Hashd al-Shaabi liberating the country from ISIS and not existing, I'm going to go ahead and say most Iraqis will say, yeah, Hashd al-Shaabi was better that they existed. Because like, I don't know, you can, like there are a lot of bullshit like compradors who scream about the PMU, about their evils, about the IRGC, but you know what? Doesn't even come close to ISIS. Doesn't even come close. I'm not even going to entertain that shit because in the end of the day, the Iraqi state is sovereign. It exists today. It's not a burning pile of rubble controlled by psychotic freaks, right? So like this is the hilarious thing. Like in Idlib, you have mandatory hijab. Okay. Have you ever heard like Idlib is a northwest? How's my geography? Northwest corner of Syria. This is the last bastion of so-called Syrian rebels. They have mandatory hijab. So mandatory hijab is the biggest problem in the world when it's in Iran. But when it's in Syria, it's freedom, guys. It's freedom. It's good. Right? Like, did you ever ask yourself when you see these rallies for support of like Syrians, like against their government, why is it all men? Like, where are the women? Gee, I wonder where the women are. Like when you see these images of like Syrian rebels holding up the heads of children that they beheaded, like they recorded their crimes because terrorizing the local population into not resisting them is what they do, like their Zionist allies, right? Like their American allies. This is one of their tactics. They use the tools of media to spread the image of like their power. Whereas I would say is that like the flip side in the case of like the people doing the counterinsurgency, like theirs is defending the status quo. Now we could talk about what the character of that status quo is, whether it's a good or bad thing, sure. But ultimately, between these actors of ISIS versus the PMU versus the Hashd al-Shaabi versus the so-called, like the sort of Shia factions, like I know whose side I'm on in all of this. And it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to all this. And in fact, a lot of Iraqis, I would say, I mean, yeah, like there is a lot of, I would say today that you can easily find anti-Iran sentiment, no doubt. But that's fine. Like let it be anti-Iran sentiment. Like if you want to hate Iran, like go ahead. But at least you're not being ruled by ISIS. Is like what I would say. At least your country isn't under the control of ISIS, which then would give Americans an excuse to come back and really like reinvade your country. So I would put it that far and say that like yeah, some Iraqis listening to this might scoff and might hate me for it, but whatever. I can't make all the friends.
I mean, I think, one of the things that came into my head as you're talking about this actually connects because you just had an episode with Henry Hakamaki and Salvatore and, that the Stalin book, right? And like one of the things that they critique heavily in that and that is this idea of abstract universalism. This idea that like, we
values
that our values are our ideals,
yeah,
may outstrip what is like politically possible and feasible within the current set of relations and contradictions that exist, right? And and so like you said, like if the choice is between ISIS and the PMU, right? Like that's a pretty easy choice, I think, for e- everybody, pretty much. And I think that anyway, I think I appreciate that. I want to bring in a couple things. One, I've tagged some comments. So first, I want to make your day, Sina, and let you know that Ariel Sharon died in
Oh,
2014.
he's get out. He's dead. I didn't know that. Thanks, Dana. When did he die?
He died in 2014. So
God
I don't know.
damn, 2014? I'm way off. I thought he was still
Yeah.
a vegetable. Well, he was a vegetable for a very long time.
Yeah. So anyways, some good news there. I do want to encourage people, if you have questions, to go ahead and drop them into the chat. There was a couple of this is I don't want to read off Wikipedia. I'll feel like Ben Shapiro, but I'm going to do it anyway. But this was actually it's in Qasem Soleimani's Wikipedia thing, and I just read this because it's fascinating because it's written by his enemies.
Yeah.
And, it says his grand strategy of directing an extended network of allied armies and militias to advance Iranian interests in the Middle East was praised by his opponents, with former Mossad director Yossi Cohen saying in 2018 that Soleimani's asymmetric warfare strategies had shaped a geopolitical landscape in which, quote, Iran effectively bordered Israel through Hezbollah, but Israel did not border Iran. Soleimani had personally tightened a noose around Israel's neck, end quote. An FBI agent and Middle East expert, Ali Soufan,
Oh, God, this guy. I know this guy.
acknowledging that Qasem Soleimani, should he be so minded, could drive his car from Tehran to Lebanon's border with Israel without being stopped. And the same route would be open to truckloads of rockets bound for Iran's main regional proxy, Hezbollah.
Yeah.
Now, I do want to say, because you mentioned this, and I think it's important to sort of underline, again, like I've been reading some of Amal Saad's work, and you recently hosted her on your podcast, Louis, who I think is still in the chat. Hello, Louis, all day. Uh, did a interview with her on your platform that's also in the new edition of Ebb Magazine up behind me. But I do want to say that, like, the proxy model, we hear this a lot, as you said. This is what you think of in terms of Western-backed, entities. But I think it's important to underline a few points around this. One, the sort of what the Iranian Revolution meant for a lot of people, and that the connection of Shia went back much before that, right, too. And so, like, with, for instance, Hezbollah, which didn't exist at the time of the Iranian Revolution, but really kind of, forms in part due to the Iran-Iraq War you talked about. That there's connections. There's familial connections. There's connections that are ideological, and
It's roots.
I think its roots, and I think it's also important to point out, like, when you talk about Yemen, like, their version of Shia, as I understand it, is very different from Iran.
There's 7. And I think there's Zaidi Shias. They're like
Zaidi, right?
7,
Zaidi, yeah. And then Hamas obviously is a Sunni force. Islamic Jihad is more directly ideologically combined with the Iranian Revolution. But I think that it's important to say, like, that these are, as you kind of laid out, like, they're all actors that are important in their own regions. They all have a base of local support and legitimacy. And one of the things I think that combines them the most, from my understanding, is actually the question of Palestine, and the question of the Zionist entity, right? And the resistance axis, what is it resisting? It's resisting Zionism and U.S. imperialism, and it may not be, they might not be the forces that all of us would say, yeah, that's my ideology, or that's my, belief system, or how I would ideally want to run a society. But they are the anti-imperialist forces that
Yep.
exist in the region and that are operating and that are developing capabilities to actually really combat, US imperialism and Zionism on the ground. And so I think that's something I wanted to say because I think it's important to, you know, we don't have this ideal force that,
Yeah.
we can just impose and say like, hey, like, here's
They're
this
the good guys.
massive
Yeah.
communist party that we all support that's, got huge support locally, etc., that is fighting back. And so anyways, I just wanted to say that briefly.
Yeah, no, it's true. And
Um
and partly what Iran has on its side is like local organic support, right? You don't need to astroturf support for Iran. Like it's not necessary, right? Because you have these older, let's say, allegiances that are bigger than a bunch of Saudis bribing you or like paying you. Like there was a video of a guy of how much like getting a Turkish passport, and so they could move to Europe, right? Like this is a pretty flimsy reason to wage a war. Like whereas like or like even now and like with these Gazans, right? Like in Gaza, you have on the one hand dudes who are protecting their homeland, protecting their families, like who are orphaned themselves, like this orphan army of Qassam, who are like watching their homeland get destroyed, who are the grandchildren of people who were thrown off their land by the grandparents of these people invading them. And the other hand, you have a bunch of like TikTok losers who are so sadistic and proud on the one hand, but on the other hand, they're conscripts who are scared beyond all measure of dying just to extend the career of a deeply unpopular Israeli politician. I mean, come on, how bleak would it be to be a Zionist fucking colonial foot trooper, like stormtrooper, marching around Gaza? Like, you can make all the TikToks you want, but like it won't cover up for the fact of like what you're doing. Like you're just there to do genocide. You're there to punish people for daring to resist you, which is basically what American which is what like hundreds of thousands of Americans were doing in Afghanistan and Iraq, like not even 20 years ago. Right? Like they were punishing locals for the resistance that they were facing for their dead friends, right? Which is like an old colonial thing, right? Like it's an old game that imperialists do. So like in the midst of all this is like a guy like Qasem Soleimani. Like, yeah, you may not like it. You may look at the Islamic Republic. You're like, yo, I don't really share much in common with that entity. Like, but like the fact is like this is a political entity that has turned that has like not just like changed the political calculus, but has turned back virtually every major plot by imperialists to extend their growth. Like, you want to talk about like failing Zionism? Like, they used to call this thing Greater Israel. They think that they could go all the way. Like, it's insane. Like
well,
greater,
right.
you were
And
gonna
I
say, yeah,
Yeah, well, it came up earlier in the chat, and I think this is just important for us to note with regard to Hezbollah too, and like why Hezbollah is such a strong, is that yes, Eretz Israel or right or Greater Israel, right?
yeah,
The idea of Israel is not, they don't even acknowledge formal borders, from my understanding,
yeah.
right? It's
The
just sort of
only
like
country doesn't have
that
borders. Yeah, Israel doesn't have any
armistice
borders.
lines or whatever, right? And so the idea is, yeah, Lebanon is part of Eretz Israel. I think what Syria too, right?
Yeah,
And like or part of it at least. And and so yeah, it's an expansionist entity too, and that is the way that it is seen by all of the actors in the region too. So it's like people don't just look at Palestine as just a group of people that have a just and a humanitarian sort of cause, right? But they actually also look, they do see that, but on
yeah.
top of that they also see Israel as this entity that would love to manifest destiny the
Yeah,
whole region,
with the with
yeah.
the ultimate manifest destiny doer, America, by doing its bidding, right? I mean, Israel is a proxy of the US. This is not like some like yeah, they're I would say they're an interesting proxy. They're a unique proxy of the US. obviously, like in the sense that like they have these kind of separate, they have a kind of sovereignty, but it's the sovereignty of mutual shared interest, which is
Yep.
war, destruction, genocide, expansionism. Like these are shared mutual interests. This is like shared political DNA. So like when people are like, "Oh, if we only had the Democrats in charge, they'd be less Zionist. Like Obama would rein them
Right.
in." It's like, what are you talking about? Obama would rein them in. Like they're all part of the same like 500-year-old white supremacist Euro white supremacist project of like settler colonialism. They're just different branches and different sort of like corporate entities, but it's all like the same like economy, right? Like, and so in the midst of all this, thinking about a guy like Qasem Soleimani. Okay, now let's think of like the reverse. I'm gonna send you a link. It's a little gruesome. I'm sorry. I'm warning you. It's a picture of a burnt corpse. I'm sorry, people, if you're offended by this. You can decide to not show it, but this is something that I think is interesting, and it actually relates. It happened 4 years ago, 4 days ago, like as of it was 2020, January 27th. A plane goes down outside of Ghazni, Afghanistan, right? Ghazni crash, plane crash, and okay, here it is. It's a 2000 it's a E11A, U.S. Air Force E11A, right? It's sometimes called Wi-Fi in the sky. It's an important kind of plane. It's a lot of it's sort of they never go down, right, so to speak, right? And so this plane goes down, and on this plane are at least two people that the U.S. acknowledges. These are the pilots, right? Like these are the like planes have two pilots, right? How's my aeronautical engineering? They usually have two pilots. So like they acknowledge two deaths, right? But then the Iranians released this picture. There was this picture that circulated. It didn't get any press here, of course. I sent it to you. If you want to show it, you can. I can also post it later if people want to see
You
it.
sent it. What'd you send it on?
I sent it to your WhatsApp. I can send it also in the chat too if they want to look. You can look for yourself.
There's a private chat. Yeah, let me see.
You can look for yourself. It's a picture of a burnt out corpse. Now, there's an interesting story here. So, like,
I don't think I'm going to show that, Sina. But
okay, it's unfortunate. I've seen this picture so much that like it doesn't affect me in any way. Also, like, so part of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani was having this trophy aspect to it. Right, is that like, and this is an imperialist thing too, is that they had a photographer on the ground there, and they got a picture of his finger with his ring finger. Right, he had this famous ring given to him by whom I don't remember, but it definitely. And so to prove that it was him, they released this picture of him that they had. So like, not only did they plan this actual like military assassination, and they released the footage of it later. You can watch it on YouTube. They released it. And then they had this picture of his finger, right? And this was circulated by, and like proudly, and to this day, like anti-Iran sort of like psychotic, like anti-Iran diaspora types, they talk about kebab day. They turned him into kebab, and like or kotlet, which is like this Iranian meat dish, like they turned him into meat or ground meat or whatever. And so like this is part of like this sort of like fuck you aspect of it. Oh, you have this hero? Like watch, we're going to step on his legacy and laugh at you. So they released this image. Now the Iranians didn't officially do this, but this image circulated and it's in the chat. I mean, it's in the chat if people want to look. Oh, that's the private chat. If people want to look, it's an image that was
I'll put
it.
I'll put it in the comments if people want to look.
Corpse. Now, the U.S. never acknowledged this picture. The U.S. never said who this was. There was never any press around this. If I was an American journalist and I saw a picture of a corpse flying around, I would say, who was this? Who is this? Don't you want to acknowledge this? Don't you have any acknowledgement of who this was? There was never any mention of this. So then the name that started going around was Mike D'Andrea, Ayatollah Mike. Ayatollah Mike was a famous career CIA officer. He was identified by the New York Times in the 2010s sometime. So was his wife. His wife is this Gujarati Indian. He's supposedly a convert to Islam, and he would pray. He was in the movie. They had a character of him in Zero Dark 30 or something, whatever that movie, the CIA movie.
Yeah,
He was in
it's an
that
awful
movie, or
movie.
not him, but an actor portraying him. So this guy's name was known. And on top of that, one of the things that Trump did to appease his big Zionist backer, Sheldon Adelson, right, who was the guy who gave him the phrase "Make America Great Again," was Sheldon Adelson, this big nasty Zionist. He's worm food now too, thank God. Bye, Sheldon. Glad you're dead. R.I.P. Bozo. Pack watch. But like Sheldon Adelson, one of the sort of legacies of Sheldon Adelson was to like, I mean, Trump was a Zionist before, but Trump really like bootlicked the Zionists during his time. And one of the things he did was put Mike D'Andrea in charge of, I think, the Iran Center at the CIA. So like the cowboys were back in charge after Obama had pushed them out. There was a different sort of regime at this in the CIA, and so he came back in 2017, and he was known. I think her name is Anna Maurizio. She's kind of connected to Assange and stuff. She kind of talked about him. He was very well known for, you know, like the Pakistani drone strike program, a lot of dirty wars stuff, a lot of like blood was on this guy's hand. I mean, he's a fucking CIA, senior CIA guy. This guy's drenched in blood. What's what the CIA is. So anyways, so this guy, according to the Iranians, is on a base in Iraq, and their guys in the base let them know when he's in the air. And an IRGC team of two guys nabs him out of the sky. They use a weapon. They nab him out of the sky. They cause this plane to crash, and then they take a picture and release it. Now, this wasn't done through state channels. This was all done through Telegram stuff, but it was ignored by the U.S. media. This is what's interesting to me. It was never portrayed. It's actually hard to find that picture. I found it on an Iranian guy's account. I'm surprised it's still up. But like Mike D'Andrea hasn't been heard from. And then like a year later, they retired him. But like they never showed his face, but they like retired him. So like, where did he go? Like, what happened to him? We all know he existed, but like the name disappeared. Right now, if you look in the Wikipedia page, like they do say that he was on, like there is like reports that like, oh, Iranians reported that he was on that plane. You can believe it. I believe it. That it's possible to nab these guys. Americans are not superhuman. You can get them, and the fact that they got them on this plane probably caught, like they had these assets in Afghanistan, God knows. And then there's all there's wreckage. There's like footage of the wreckage that's out there to be viewed, and it didn't go down from technical failure. That's what like they came out late. What's funny, this is the best part. God, to be an American military dude, they later said, oh, it was partly pilot error. Could you imagine? You die for your military, chauffeuring around some bloodthirsty ghoul in the sky. You die for him, and then your state later says, "Oh yeah, it was pilot error." Like it's the funniest shit in the world. The American like empire machine. So like this thing about. This thing was partly like the response. It happened like 4 weeks later, but unlike the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, there was never a public event, and this I think reflects the different like what's at stake in both countries' sort of like relationships. All this. On the one hand, you have a guy who's an actual national hero. Okay, millions of people attended his funeral. Millions. Like okay, some diaspora bootlicker like whatever like resist, like regime change Mongol idiot will probably yell at me and say, "Oh, they forced them to go to that funeral. Oh, you don't know Iran." I don't give a shit. I don't believe it. Human beings by the millions can't be marshaled out. Like this guy was a genuine national hero, whether like diasporoid losers like it or not. Like he was a national hero. Like his face, and that's partly his legacy, partly like the potency of his job was to be a media figure, right? Like they called him the shadow commander, right? Like because he was everywhere, you could find him, right? Like the like Time magazine said the man who defeated ISIS and put him on the cover, right? And so like this is an anti-fascist general, right? Like if ISIS is a fascist force, which it was, then the people who fought them are de facto anti-fascists, right? Like not you can't get around this fact, and this guy was like spearheading the charge. So like this response, like these two different figures like of Mike D'Andrea versus Qasem Soleimani, like they found, like the Iranians went and did the equivalent to the US, right? Like if you believe it, if you believe that that guy is Mike D'Andrea, that picture of that corpse is Mike D'Andrea, even though it's never mentioned, and the fact that it's never mentioned is all the proof that I need to say that it was him. Because like if you look back, there is this history of Iranians parading the body parts of fallen military guys. So like after Operation, what was it called? Claw Hook, something Hook, some Eagle Claw, Operation Eagle Claw, the thing to get the the captives out of the U.S. embassy. I don't call them hostages; they weren't hostages; they were captives. So like to get them out, they had this like cockamamie plan to fly like 4 helicopters full of these special forces guys, and to like get them out. And there was like a sandstorm. There was like this sandstorm, and they like caused 2 of them to go back. 2 of the planes crashed. One of them had to go down. The other one clipped the other one. It was a big fucking disaster. And one of the results were all these corpses of U.S. dudes just flayed around in the Iranian desert. And like Iranian, there was like the famous, what was his name? Controversial figure. He was an Ayatollah. He was a cleric. I can't remember his name. He had this high-pitched laugh he was famous for. Somebody in the chat may know, an Iranian in the chat may know. But like he was famous for parading around body parts. And this was like, look, you want to come to our country? This is what's going to happen to you. So this is like psychological warfare that you wage against your enemy to say like, oh yeah, you want to come? This is your so-called power, right? And like those images were displayed by the American media. Like there's an episode with the Radio War Nerd, if you listen to those guys, and the host talks about how bitter that feeling it was to see those. Like he remembered to those days. He used the term, I remember it well. I know that episode well. He used the term bile to describe like the feeling, right? Like this was like a finger in the eye of the US empire, right?
Oh, for
So
sure.
like there is a tradition of this, and the fact that the US never did anything with this picture, it never acknowledged it. No enterprising journalist, like no Intercept reporter went out and ever did anything about this picture is hilarious to me, and just proof that yeah, man, the Iranians are fucking right. They got the equivalent of Qasem Soleimani easily. But the fact is, unlike the Iranian case where he's a national hero, well known for his work, who works in the open, whose name is known, whose biography is known, that the opposite is this ghoulish monster named Mike D'Andrea, who like has zero support, who happily will just destroy countries left and right, because ultimately this is the reflective, at least to me, I'll argue with this. I'll happily argue with people that this is reflective of the 2 different projects. On the one hand, this guy is the guy who defeated ISIS. On the other hand, the guy who helped probably bring ISIS into existence, right? Like Mike D'Andrea probably. I don't know if he actually was, but like that is the force that like brought them together. And so there is this weird symmetry that like has never been acknowledged, that the US has never even come close to. I would love to see some journalists take this on. I guess I could. I'm no journalist, but nobody would care what I say. I'm some internet crank. But like ultimately the fact that like nothing was done about this picture is proof to me that like, yeah, man, this was a serious blow. And I bet, and because the CIA is the CIA, they were like, okay, good. Got one less pain in the ass to deal with. Like left holdover from the Trump era, because that was when the Trump era was coming to an end. That was 2020. Trump was already, that was after January 6th too. So like Trump and the war with the deep state was really headed to someplace interesting. So like the CIA wasn't going to lose its mind defending this guy and claiming this guy. That's also not what the CIA does, right?
They
So
never
like,
do that anyway.
yeah,
Yeah.
anyway, so like it's not like that's not what they do. They got so mad when one of their, I mean, they did get like the Valerie Plume whatever affair, and Joe whatever, the thing with Robert Novak. I mean, they put those guys in jail that did it. But yeah, like I think there's a lot of deep state fuckery that happens, and it happens between states too. And the assassination of Qasem Soleimani was something to flex on their enemies, but it was just a flex. Because this is where I'm going with all this. And this is kind of what I started with, is that like the question is like, who makes history in the end, right? Like who makes history? Is it individuals? Right? Like, is it like actual, is it like, the Hegelian term? I'm sorry to do this. This is my training. I can't help this. But like the Hegelian term is like world historical men.
Right.
So like, this is like, are there actually world historical men in our human history who have these like determining roles? Or or are we like, or is there like just like, are there like masses of human beings who are put forward by, let's, in our case, in our modern history, state actors, right? Like who have the support of states, like big wealthy, like to the tune of hundreds of millions, who have the resources to wage these important let's say military campaigns, who then go forward and then achieve things, like in the case of Iraq, defeating ISIS, like in the case of Syria, keeping the government alive, right? Which again couldn't do without Russian air power. By the way, Russian air power is critical to the story of Syria's survival, of like the Syrian government's survival. So like that's all of this, and like Vladimir Putin didn't fly those drones that like bombed out those headquarters of like Syrian rebels. He didn't fly the planes, right? It was like regular Russian dudes, like Air Force guys who died. There's like stories of like famous guys who like died defending themselves. They were being like, so like there's all these individual stories, and Qasem Soleimani is one, but his story is different insofar as his role as like his role in media is different. And I think that's what's interesting here. I mean, we can think about other examples that are similar. Is that like there's the example of like the so-called Iraqi Rambo, this guy named Abu Azrael, his nickname is. He's a famous figure in all of this. I mean, he's a controversial figure. He was a PMU fighter. He was known to like basically flay ISIS guys, like flay them with knives, like just and do it on camera and stuff, like just like unpleasant stuff, but like it's a Machiavellian thing, right? Like, what do you do to these dudes who are like raping babies and like destroying villages and like murdering hundreds by like murdering like children and whatever, right? Like, what do you do to that? Do you respond by being nice? Right? Like, do you respond by like, like what do you do? So like part of the response was brutal. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, the images associated with like the 2010s are brutal. But the thing is, here in the West, we celebrated one side and then vilified or ignored the other side. Whereas, like, if you're going to be a more judicious subject, you're going to talk about all of the different sides and you're going to assess them for their various things. So, yeah, I'm going to assess the Syrian rebels for what's left of them, which is a hollowed out American proxy in the northwest of Syria, funded by Turkey and backed by Turkey, by the way. Like, they would have nothing if they didn't have Turkey protecting them. Right? Like, that's the other role in all this, too, is that the Turkish state had to invade Syria on the cover of, the PKK SDF is getting too much power. We don't like that. We're not going to allow them to we're going to create a buffer zone between us and them. But like in reality, it was to protect their assets. So like there's the Turkish backed like FSA, right? Like I think it's called TFSA, Turkish Free Syrians Army, right? And they're the backbone of the so-called People's Revolution in Syria. To me, that is a reflection of where that Syrian revolution went. And the book on this is Ali Qadri and Linda Matar's great book, Syria from National Independence to Proxy War. It's a 2019 book. It's a very good book. Readers, you should totally get it. Ali Qadri did an episode of my show. It's very good. It's a great book.
He did one with us too. Yeah.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, from Syria, from national independence to proxy war. You should definitely pick it up. It is a more judicious, and especially given how much intensive psychological warfare there was around Syria. Like, it's only like you should look at the other side. You should take the other side, especially when we're in the West and we really only. I mean, they gave an Oscar to the White Helmets guys, to like the producers of the film of the White Helmets, which, by the way, those people never stepped foot in Syria. They just they were editors. They were glorified editors, and then they just so happened to get an Oscar, right? Like, if you can't see a psyop in that, then you don't see anything. So yeah, I would be curious if there's any questions in the chat. I rambled for fucking 2 hours here.
That was great. There's a couple, so let me pull up. First of all, Sina is Charlie from It's Always Sunny trying to explain world politics to us. Sina needs an expo board next time. Can't keep up. But let's see. So let's talk about this quickly. So, does the axis of resistance have short-term incentive for the current war to continue in its current escalated form? No one in the West was talking about the area before October 7th.
So Yeah, that's a little bit tricky question because in the end, like Qassam is a member of the Axis resistance, right? So I'm guessing the question has to do is that like what is the sort of geostrategic interest in Al-Aqsa flood in the um, in the continued sort of unfolding of the consequences of Al-Aqsa flood, right? Like this genocidal war. I would say overall is that like part of like the functioning of Al-Aqsa flood. And now, if you believe Nasrallah, who said we didn't have any forewarning of Al-Aqsa flood, um, I would tend to believe him. I think that they're within the Axis. These are independent actors who decide themselves on their actions. And I would say that communicating your plans of this massive military and very daring military plan to people far beyond your borders is just generally not a good idea. So like and as if and it's not like Qassam needs and like the Palestinian resistance needs the blessing of Hezbollah, Iran, the Yemenis. They don't need their blessing. Like this is an interactive force. So I would say is that like the benefit is pretty minor. I would say that like if anything, there's a kind of like and I discount this the most. I don't think much of this, but there is the kind of like popular theater in all of this because like all these Palestinian actors, like state actors, non-state actors, like there are some who have been fighting Zionists this whole time, and others who have been like not allying, but basically making peace with them. And so like one thing that this did was really put the nail in the coffin of Oslo. That Oslo was intended to really split the Palestinian national movement and to split them into these two wings. On the one hand, you have Gaza, and the other hand, you have the West Bank. And in the West Bank, you have this relatively affluent ruling class who are connected to the ruling party, Fatah, which hasn't had elections in over a decade and a half, which is ruled by this octogenarian, like gall-funded loser, Mahmoud Abbas, who has zero relevance on all this. You think Palestinians actually look to Mahmoud Abbas as some kind of leader? We can talk about the failure of Yasser Arafat all we can. We can talk about his failures, but by the end of his life, he had kind of done a 180. And he had kind of, by the end of his life, said like he didn't say this, but I had kind of made a mistake with this Oslo thing, and look where we've gotten us. We're more controlled now than ever, and we exchanged it for what? And that's part of the reason why he was killed. And he was killed. He was assassinated, right? Like they found the polonium. They found it, like it was out there. Like this guy was killed. He was assassinated by someone inside his ruling faction or whatever, or who knows, or in coordination with Mossad, or who knows. Right? Like there's some fuckery there. And the guy who took over from him is still in charge. So think about that for a second. Think about what that means. And this guy has worked his best to control the Palestinian security forces, right? The PSF, right? Who have a considerable armory under their control, but who haven't really turned it against the Zionists, whose main faction is to be a police of the Palestinian street, so called. So like this is a strange point we're in, where the actors who have the least amount of official power, like in the West Bank, this is the so-called triangle of Jenin, Tulkarm, and Nablus. I think that's the triangle. It's called like the something triangle of fire, I want to say. I can't remember. I'm like mixing all these things up. Maybe somebody in the chat knows. But essentially, this is where the militancy is the greatest, and which is why the Zionists have been treating it like they treat Gaza, right? Like they leave Ramallah alone for a reason. Like they focus on these other places because that's where the militancy is, right? And not everybody agrees with the Palestinian Authority. Not everybody is on their side. And so like containing the Palestinian national movement into like friendly pro-Zionist or like healthily Zionist forces versus the anti-Zionist forces has been one of the strategies. And that's been something that's been failing more and more. Is it completely failed? No. Right, because they still have their thumb over a chunk of the West Bank, and that's not changing. And could I see the West Bank rising up in an intifada? If it hasn't happened by now, it won't happen. If it hasn't happened witnessing everything, I don't know. Anything can happen in history. I shouldn't say that. And that's a disservice, I would say, to Palestinians, because I'm sure a lot of them desire freedom, and they support, at least in some ways, the military resistance of Palestinians. But at the same time, they have their internet being watched by Zionists, their telecommunications watched by Zionists, and on top of that, there's the security force. I mean, Zionists invade their hospitals and assassinate like hospital patients, right? So like, we know we know who like the overriding power of the West Bank is, and that's the IOF. So like in all of that, I would say the Axis has proven that it's like, oh yeah, you want to join a side? Like, look at the side who like gets results. Look at the side who like is successfully withstanding a genocidal war, right? Because like the Zionists are failing in their strategy of displacing the Palestinian population, because this is their fantasy, right? Like they want a collapse of Gaza. They want to get the leadership, the military and the political leadership, and they want to get their so-called hostages back. None of these things have accomplished, and they haven't scared people into leaving permanently. Palestinians are staying. So they're accomplishing the goal of destroying Gaza and making it unlivable, but they're failing in their goal of chasing them out into Egypt. So this is a dynamic, and if anything, that what's supporting them is the axis of resistance. And on top of that, remember, in the midst of all of this, Yemen has crippled the Zionist economy in a way that Egypt couldn't do. A state as big as Egypt in the 60s couldn't do under Nasser, just because of their geography, because of where the Bab al-Mandab is, because of the role of container shipping and its importance to the global economy. This is something that this is something that cannot be understated. The accomplishments of the Yemenis with a minimal amount of firepower, like they use nothing in their arsenal to achieve this, right? And they've been subjected to American attacks, but like, what can Americans do what can Americans do in like a week or 2 weeks or a couple of months that Saudis and UAE and Qataris didn't do for years? So like, there is an inflection point that we're at in the Yemeni front, in the Red Sea, that cannot be underestimated. And then you want to talk about the North. I mean, I said this earlier, like the North, like Zionists have lost land in the North. Like what they wanted to achieve in Gaza is being done to them in the north of Palestine. Like it's not livable there. Like their soldiers are afraid to go there. Hezbollah terrorizes them, and they cannot. Like they pulled out of there. Like you think they're gonna move back? Like that will be some kind of achievement to move back. 50% of the homes are destroyed. Right now, they did it when they had escaped. Hezbollah, unlike the IOF, doesn't bomb people while they're living there. They had already ordered with retreat, and now they have made those places unsafe to Zionist settlers. Right, the same way the Palestinian factions have made the Gaza envelope unsafe. Right, the so-called Gaza envelope. Like it's not livable. Right, Zionists need 100% tranquility. They need complete submission. And the fact that Palestinians haven't done that, Lebanese have not done that, Yemenis haven't done that, that's a victory for the axis of resistance completely. Completely. Oh, and we
Yeah,
haven't even
I
talked
think the
about the Iraqi resistance. The Iraqis are hitting Haifa. They're fucking hitting Haifa, right? Like their treasure zone. Think about how far they have to go to hit Haifa. Now imagine in an open war with Lebanon, what would happen to Haifa? Like that's insane. To think about that is just like, blah.
yeah, I think there's a lot that we didn't get to. I think what I would say too regarding it all is like, one of the interesting things in studying a little bit of Hezbollah and also the Axis is just this understanding that they have of the coming war, right? And like that there is always a preparation for the fact that they need to continue to develop their capabilities, that they want to ultimately be able to remove the Zionist entity from the region. And so it's like, I think in some ways, I don't think we're there yet, but I think that this has been a demonstration of capabilities that are far beyond what we've seen in prior
Yeah,
wars, and obviously it's
absolutely.
also a demonstration of the utter depravity of Israel, right? But
Yeah,
at the same time, as you said, like the public theater thing, and I agree with you. I think people place a little bit too much in some conversations of like, oh, October 7th happened so that, Hamas could demonstrate to the world exactly who the Israelis are. But I think that it has done that, right? Like, I think that for so many people, it's so hard now to go back and,
Yeah.
like, I feel like the idea of decolonizing Palestine now and removing the Zionist entity, is has to have gained a ton of traction. I mean, I don't think, like, just globally, I mean, and I don't whether that translates to, what kind of material support, what actions people take, what, whatever, like, all of that is remains to be seen. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that there's been a lot of talks in the last few days about possibly getting to an agreement. Doesn't seem like that's in place. There was a discussion, one of the in Al Mayadeen today, there was a discussion of they didn't name from which resistance faction, but they sort of said like one group is certainly not ready to accept the proposal that's
Yeah.
handed as it is, and like so there's still internal debates and discussions around that. So I think it's plausible that we could be getting close to a ceasefire, and I, for one, kind of hope so, just from a humanitarian perspective of all of it. But um, I don't think that even that means that like there's, as you said, there's certain things that have happened that can't just be undone, and I mean I think that we'll know more as the years go on. I think in terms of how this will unfold from here, but.
Yeah, no, and we are living in like an insane time. Like
Yeah.
historically, like there's so much unfolding. Just the ICJ case, I would say too, has opened a door that previously seemed just completely barred up. Now, I think I think in some ways you have to kind of like really doubt that these kind of like in these reports of I unfortunately have like come to sort of be skeptical about that today's reports of the ceasefire if it's actually going to happen. I don't know. I just don't know because there's a lot of political calculations to be made on the Zionist side that I don't see just simply because partly what Al-Aqsa did was to expose the flaws and contradictions inside the political elite of the Zionist entity. So you have this decrepit core of octogenarians and like old school guys who are just around forever who have nothing to offer but their own legacies, right? And partly has to do with Sharon, partly like Sharon too, is that like these guys are just walking vegetables of like a previous age when Israel really could flex and it had no fears, right? Like these guys were all way like forged in the era of like when the Arab armies were attacking Israel. Some of them on horseback, okay? Like to give you a sense of like whereas like Israel has this like nuclear fucking arsenal and it enjoys every Western backing, all the backer like support of the West. Like they're fighting an enemy that has like very like a mixed bag of arsenal, right? So like partly the generation of Israeli Zionists. I mean, it's a little bit older than now, but like those dudes were used to those kind of wars. But now it's a different game, and on top of that, the nature of Israel's population and like the thing that makes Israel appealing to a Western tourist, right? To like a Western, like a tourist in the sense of like a Zionist, a potential Zionist settler, is also what makes it like unappealing. It's like, gee, I could live here where there's war and I could be called up and I could lose my legs and I could get roasted like a fucking chestnut in a stupid ass tank. Or I could go live comfortably in New York City or LA or Miami. Gee, I wonder which one I would choose, right? Whereas like the guys in Gaza, that's all they have. This is the only place they have. So like there is a thing about roots and like what makes Israel like a nice place to go and colonize is also a nice place to leave the moment it gets uncomfortable, right? And so like this is also like you're getting into like the soft sort of like underbelly of like Israeli demography in a way. And on top of that, you have like the political contradictions of like the rabid, like psychotic, religious nationalist movement, which represents a minority of Israelis politically, but on their foreign policy side they support, right? Which is Ben Gavir, Smotrich, or whatever, and those like psycho loons who are now part of the government, who are to the right of Netanyahu, if you thought that was possible, right? Like Netanyahu is to like the left of them, and then you have the traditional sort of power base of Israeli politics, which is the left, sort of left labor liberal Zionist core, right? Which are like complete non-entity at this point, right? And so like this war
They're
has
marching. Yeah, they're
yeah.
marching to deny humanitarian aid to
Yeah.
Gaza. That's what they're doing
Yeah.
right now. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like this is not like a this is not like a this is a failure of their own, this is a failure of their own political system that can't achieve anything, right? And so on top of that, you then have the military, which is, remember, a conscript military, right? You have people who are forced in, right? Like, yeah, they have their elite brigades, whatever, but like when you factor that into like, geez, this is dirty urban warfare, right? Like they're sitting in tanks. They don't go leave their tanks. They don't go out into like to go looking, because they would lose guys, right? Because their military strategy is flatten everything, create a cordon sanitaire, whatever, and then march her in and then take some TikToks and show how and flex on your enemies, right? And terrorize them, right? But like that doesn't get you any gains. That doesn't stand you up against a Yasin, right? Which is like this tandem weapon, which is amazing. I mean, they name weapons after their fallen sheikhs, right? So like the Qassam brigades, like the Yasin, the Ayash missile, like these are all legacies of previous generations of fighters, right? Like, do you think like an Israeli today
Is it
gives?
the
Sorry.
Al Ghul sniper
Yeah,
rifle,
the
right?
Al
Is that
Ghul
what it
sniper
is?
rifle. Like these are all like. Do you think an Israeli gives a shit who's fighting today gives a shit about fucking Ben Gurion, about Moshe Dayan? Do you think they actually have a kind of political continuity to their military? No, they don't. They just have like fancy night vision goggles and expensive phones and drones going in the sky and like an elaborate tank with like a big viewfinder that they can like push a button. But like that's not how you win a military struggle today, especially in like especially trying to like doing counterinsurgency. It's just not going to work. Ask the Americans what it was like to fight the Iraqis. Ask them what it was like to fight the Taliban that they fled from in the end after like leaving, right? Like they fled in stages, right? Like they left. It wasn't a withdrawal all at once, but it was essentially an admit that like, yeah, we can't win against these guys even though we enjoy every single technical military economic advantage over them.
Right on. I think we've covered a lot of ground, Sina. I really
Hell
appreciate
yeah.
it.
2 hours of nonstop Cena yelling.
No, it was great.
Heroic
Fantastic
people in the
show.
chat.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at the chat
Yeah.
now. Wow, thanks guys. You still here?
Yeah. Yeah.
48
Um
people. Wow, 48 people are beautiful people. We have 48 beautiful people in this chat.
Sina, it's been great. And I'm sure that folks who came in already, follow you, support you. But if you don't, then, definitely do so. We'll have to do this again.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. You got to
Um
come on my show.
I'm happy to. Yeah,
Yeah, let's do
yeah.
an
I don't know
episode
what I would
soon.
say, but yeah.
We can talk about
Um
something not Palestine related.
um but yeah, I mean it's always good to be in conversation with you. You always manage to keep material that could be like quite dark and bleak entertaining and at times even funny, so I appreciate that.
Thank you, man.
And we ended up who do we kill along? Oh, Ariel Sharon. Yeah, we killed Ariel
Ariel
Sharon
Sharon's
along the
dead. I
way.
didn't even know that. What a great day.
Right on. So anyways, thanks everybody for tuning in. Really
Thank
appreciate
you,
it.
everyone.
And we'll be back next week with some more shows. Not ready to announce them
Oh,
yet,
yeah,
but
you're
we'll
right.
be
We
probably
will bring
tomorrow.
Jared on Tanky Group Therapy. Yeah, Jay, you got to come on. It's because Sunday is his family day. He's got to be a dad.
No, I'll come on Sunday.
Okay, good.
I'll come on
Good,
Sunday.
good, good. Good,
Yeah,
good,
yeah,
good.
yeah.
You
All
can
right.
come on the
All
next
right.
one. Okay, take
All right.
care,
Peace,
man.
everybody. All right.